I mean, what does someone do though when they're stuck in a situation like that, especially as kids? What are your recommendations? What are your suggestions?
So as kids, you have no way out. Literally, you are dependent as a child. The problem is when we're adults and we carry that same programming, we forget we're adults now, right? Because when we get triggered in the abusive relationships, what happens is we get triggered back to childhood. We start to feel like a helpless, dependent child again. And so when you are a kid, you look for survival mechanisms: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So maybe first you try to fight against whatever's happening. And maybe if you're given the right to fight, you fight and you fight and you fight. And that's how you try to assert your sense of self. And then you become an adult who's always fighting with everybody. And anytime anybody says anything, you're fighting against it. You know, they tell you that they started eating whatever. Oh, and it's wrong. It's wrong. And you got to eat this way. And it's exhausting to be around people like that. And you wonder like why nobody wants to be around you. But for a lot of people, they tried to fight and they very quickly learned that that's a dangerous thing to do because you'll be punished. You'll have very negative response to that. So what do? You turn to flight, which is the escapism behaviors we talked about, and even dissociation, right? Just not even being there, like literally your mind, soul leaving your body so that you're not here feeling the pain in your body and all of those feelings. And other people learn to shut down. So like, let's say you're in a car ride as a kid, there is no escape from that car ride. Either you've got a rageaholic parent or you've got a grandparent or someone torturing you the entire way, or maybe a sibling. There's no escape from that car ride. So what do? You shut down. What does that mean? That's a neurological shutdown. So in the animal kingdom, when a mouse gets caught by a cat, it doesn't even have to think about it. Its nervous system immediately feigns death. What does that mean? It's shutting down vital systems: respiration, heart rate, digestion. And one of two things is going to happen. Either the cat's going to eat the mouse, or something will happen and the mouse will have the opportunity to run away. So it will be able to mobilize out of that immobilization of the shutdown and run away as a defense mechanism. But as human beings, we often get in these situations, relationships, whether it was in childhood or as adulthood, where it feels inescapable. That could even be a job that somebody has. It feels inescapable because they don't know how to make money. They don't know how to, live without that. And when you feel like there's no escape in there, your nervous system shuts down. But because it's shutting down vital systems, we cannot stay in that shutdown state for long term because your body is literally dying. So as humans, we adapt by dissociating. So we go into the flight mechanism. Dissociation is a flight. And so people will get stuck in what you'll hear about functional freeze state nowadays. More and more people are recognizing they're in a state of functional freeze. Maybe they have just enough energy to go to work or to go to school and do some basic hygiene and life things. But then they go home and then they just zombie out on the cell phone, TV, drugs, alcohol, whatever it is. That's a functional freeze state. That's a mostly dissociated state. And then the other option is fawning. So often when we're in childhood, we learn that the best way to survive is to comply, to do what the abuser wants, because there's a temporary reprieve from the abuse when you do that. Temporary, right? So like for the moment they stop abusing you because you give them what they want, whatever that is. But that programs us neurologically to keep doing that as adults. And then it's very easy to get pulled into abusive relationships and workplaces and other situations in life, because you learn that if you comply, there's a temporary reprieve, and you don't recognize that compliance never ends the abuse. It just prolongs the cycle.
That's a huge one to remember there too. And I've liked what you said about this as well. The nervous system doesn't forget this stuff. And people may say, oh, just get over it. You were traumatized. So what? But that's not what your nervous system says. Your nervous system, even when you're around those people again, or in situations that remind you of that, that nervous system response can act up. So what do you do in that case? What do you do to help your nervous system recover?
So there's two aspects to this. One aspect is recognizing the programming. And so the neurological programming is going to sound like belief systems. I don't have the right to exist. I'm unworthy. If I'm successful, bad things are going to happen, right? These are all programs, distortions, lies that we get programmed to believe in childhood. So we got to root out those programs from the subconscious and reprogram them. And then the other aspect is actually digesting and processing the frozen trauma. So all of that stuff gets frozen in the nervous system and in the body. That's why we can't heal trauma just by talking about it. We have to go beyond the conscious mind. We have to get to the body, to the subconscious, to access that energy, which is numbed. And then when we get triggered, it becomes hyper reactive, right? That's when we see it on the surface. But most of the time, it's numbed out. We don't feel it. And that's why we're so exhausted when we have the frozen trauma, because it's like your freezer. It takes a lot of energy to maintain that stuff frozen in there, right? And so to maintain the trauma below the surface of your conscious awareness is exhausting. So we need to process and digest it. So first we need to become aware of it, when it comes into our consciousness, and recognize that. And then just like the actual digestion process, you start to break it down. Well, figuratively, that would be analysis, right? So you start to analyze the problem, you start to talk about it, and you start to break it down into manageable pieces. That's when you're breaking it down in your mouth and in the stomach. But then it gets to the small intestine, and that's where you have to filter the nutrients from the waste. So people think like trauma is just all bad. We just want to get rid of it and purge it. But actually, there's gems in there. There are nutrients in there. What are those? That's your strength, your wisdom, your resilience. Like you learned something. You learned a lot of important virtues from what happened, if you can look at it from that lens. And so that's the process of separating the two, because just like in the digestion process, we don't want to get rid of everything. We need the nourishment, we need the nutrients, and then we need to assimilate and integrate those into our life and discard the rest.
Right.
So both of those are important, is recognizing the trauma programming and also digesting and processing and integrating the trauma.
So things like EMDR, do you think that's one of the best ways to heal that trauma and to integrate it?
I've never experienced that. I'm not a super fan of what I've heard, but what I do understand what it does is it unifies, it reconnects both sides of the brain.
Right.
You can do that through Qigong and other activities where you're crossing the midline of your body, right? All that does though is bring it into your awareness. Then what? Right? You need more than that. So there's other forms of holistic therapies that I think are very, very effective, like theta healing, for example, like what Thomas Hubel teaches with presencing. That's that whole digestive process where you can allow the feelings to come up, to sit with them instead of pushing them away or instead of numbing it out, and allowing it to come up and actually digesting it. And then also, like, we really need an empathic witness. We can't heal entirely alone. Like, there are important things we need to do for ourselves, like self-regulation and taking responsibility, because nobody else can take responsibility or actually heal you except for you. You have to be willing to do that. But it's also really important to have empathic witnesses with us, because there's something really magical that happens in the healing process. Like, we share light codes with one another. And so if you've healed from something that I'm trying to heal from, just by being with you, you don't even have to say it, but we are actually exchanging information at an energetic level. And that can inspire something, a catalysis that happens within me, that suddenly I get a new insight. Suddenly I have a breakthrough because of our connection.
Right. And all of this is so important because, like you were saying before, when someone's in that kind of free state, that's when they're going to get more of these autoimmune disorders and probably other kinds of issues. I wouldn't be surprised at all if cancers could be related to this, but it does make us sick on more areas than just one. So it's so important, this topic.
Yeah, because the body, when it shuts down those systems, right, it's actually also shutting down metabolism and the immune system. So people will get more sick when they've been through abusive situation. And it's a real shame that doctors are not trained to recognize this. Like, when people have chronic illness, they don't ask questions like, what was going on in your life and leading up to the point when you got sick? What's going on in your life right now? They don't know to ask that. And why do people gain so much weight often when they've been through abusive relationships? Sometimes it's because eating is one of those escapisms, but other times people start eating right, they start exercising, they're like, why am I not losing weight? Because the metabolism is shut down, because they're in that freeze dissociative state. So the body needs to get mobilized again.
Right.
So, if you're a child and maybe it was even sexual abuse or something, and you didn't know you had the right to fight back, what you may need to actually practice is mobilizing your body. So when you get into that freeze state, maybe you need to kick and scream in your bed to, like, literally train your body that you have that option now. Or maybe you were in an abusive relationship even as an adult, which paralleled something in childhood, and you didn't realize you could leave. So maybe you need to practice standing up from your chair and walking out the door, and just literally practicing that, because you're retraining your nervous system to mobilize itself.
Right. Where do you see people get stuck in this process when maybe people first understand narcissism and they start learning about it? Where do you see the most people get stuck?
I would say 90% of people who watch channels on content like this and podcasts and things like that, 90% of people get stuck in the early stage of healing, which is like the educational stage, where you develop this ravenous hunger to learn everything that you can about what happened to you, about narcissistic abuse and the narcissist and the psychopath and like all the things. You learn all the lingo, you start speaking this new language. Why? Because it feels immensely relieving to finally have a name for what happened to you, because you thought you were crazy because everybody blamed you for what happened. And even when you tried to tell people that are good people, like they're like, something must be wrong with you, right? So there was all this blame. And now you finally understand what happened. So that relief, people will often confuse with healing. And you'll see them years and years later on these channels like, I'm all healed now, and clearly you're not if you're still like in that stage. So that's where I think most people get stuck. I'm speaking from personal experience. I was stuck in that too. I was in the victimhood for nearly 38 years of my life before I took that leap over the first threshold with self-responsibility, where I recognized the insanity of my own behavior. Insanity in this case, Einstein's definition, doing the same thing over and over again, hoping to get different results. Of course, I wasn't going to get love and compassion from that person, right? Like, how many times am I going to learn that? And I'm just going to keep blaming her and keep blaming her and keep blaming her instead of taking responsibility for myself. That's the hardest leap for people to make. That first threshold is stepping into the commitment to self-responsibility.
I love it. I mean, because before I was talking more about narcissism, that is what I talked about. I talked about radical self respect, and I would go from like the 7 habits of highly effective people in your circle of influence. And I tried to start with that. And I realized at that point, a lot of people weren't ready for that. And so I started talking more about the pain points. But just like you, it's kind of not as much on my radar now where I want to move forward as well, as also with what I talk about too. And I think one of the things that'll help with that also is there's another thing you said in your interview with Dr. Les Carter. You had said since we're mammals, right, that we have an amygdala and a limbic system, that it associates, people will seek out connection more than they'll seek out the truth, because that disconnection can seem life threatening to the nervous system. I would like you to amplify on that there.
Yeah, so I learned this from Dr. Stephen Porges, who created the polyvagal theory, which is a way to understand the mammalian limbic system and how it works in human beings. And so because the nervous system, we need to have, they call it social homeostasis. We need to be able to co-regulate with one another in order to be fully healthy. And so when we feel a disconnection, when we feel a danger or a life threat, whether it's real or perceived life threat, our nervous system goes into that defensive state. We can't connect. We seek the connection as our primary survival state, because when we go back to our earliest human roots, we absolutely had to be connected in our tribe in order to survive. And now, of course, we have all these distortions with modern world, and we think that we can be these little islands of fierce and radical independence. But yeah, being independent is good, but we also need to be interdependent, right? But coming back to that connection, so let's say you're in an abusive situation, in a relationship, family system, workplace, whatever, the part of you that seeks connection is going to minimize the truth. If it means that you're going to be ostracized, that you're going to lose the social support, that you're going to be lonely, because that loneliness will take you back to your childhood wound usually. And so maybe you don't want to see the truth about the abuse. Maybe you ignore the things that are happening. Maybe you see what's happening, but you won't speak up because you need that connection more, at least from your perspective. But again, that's our mammalian wiring. So it's a miracle when a person is able to recognize the truth, like the abuse, for example, and actually go no contact or set boundaries and get out of that situation, because it's like you're overriding your biology, and your biology will betray you and keep you in these abusive situations if you don't have the strength to do that.
Right. And no contact is very important for a lot of people, because especially for the narcissistic people, they do not know how. to respect boundaries. It's either they're incapable or just flat out unwilling. So trying to turn down the dial on a lot of those kinds of relationships, it's just not going to work. They put you in these positions where they're going to try to drive you insane and they're going to cause all sorts of chaos and destruction, or you just cut them off and you don't give them the opportunity to do so. And that's why I'll say going no contact is great for that reason from those kinds of people, because there is no turning down the dial and there isn't much of a choice if you want that sanity. If you want sanity and peace, their presence is completely going to be contradictory to that. So it's important